Thank you, everybody, for attending. So my name is Venkat, Rajaji, Vice President of Product Management and Marketing at Courion. So I'll walk into a little bit, I won't get into too much detail, but just for those who don't know who Courion is, our mission is really around helping customers succeed in a world of open access, increasing threats, and really our purpose is to make sure that people have the right access to the right resources, and they're really doing the right things with that access. And when you think about this, for all of us here in this room, this can be very difficult. It's a very complicated thing to deal with. There are a lot of different stresses on us that we have to deal with. We think about routine changes in our business around hiring, terminations, promotions, etc., and the impact that has on identity and access. You think about business changes, mergers and acquisitions. It's part of our everyday business, reorganizations, etc. And then you think about the emerging technologies, mobile devices, cloud applications, on-premise applications. So all of these things ultimately have a major impact on what we do in terms of granting access, providing access, entitlements, etc. So it's fairly complicated with all of these things just to do the day-to-day job of identity, and that's why obviously everybody's here. And then when you think about that, it becomes even harder to manage because of all of the different regulations that we have to deal with in order to ensure compliance for all of these different mandates, right? And why has the government gotten involved? The government's gotten involved because they see all these data breaches, so it's now their job to make sure that we're protecting ourselves, and they're putting more and more legislation, more and more regulation, and we all have to live by all of these different regulations that exist in the marketplace today that makes our jobs even harder, in addition to the daily hardness of our jobs as it is, right? So, because of this, identity and access governance, which I think Gartner is now calling IGA, Identity Governance and Administration, it became a burning platform, right? This is the thing that became the most important thing, is I have to make sure that I'm meeting the regulations and I'm meeting compliance for governance and regulatory mandates, and it becomes the most important thing now and becomes critical, so much so that identity and access management projects are moving from the CISO's office to the Chief Risk and Chief Compliance Officer's office now as well. So compliance is now becoming a big driver for identity access and governance process. And so what this means is that for the first time ever, business owners have to answer questions like, who has access to what does that access allow them to do, and why do they need that access? Typically nobody really thinks about this stuff. We need access in order to do our jobs on a day-to-day basis. I need access to the ERP system. It's simple stuff. You take it for granted, but now with all of this governance and regulation, we have to start asking these questions and asking harder questions, and it's become the reality. And you contrast that to how things used to be. When we think about where the world used to be, this was our data center. These were the people who had access to our most important systems. They stored everything on tape, they had to access the mainframe using punch cards, and they wore cardigan sweaters in the data center as well, because it was kind of chilly. But today, this is what our kind of data center looks like, right? People have access to things from anywhere, from everywhere, and it's not just our own employees, our internal or our contractors. This is where the hackers are too. They're right there. They're amongst us. We don't know this. We don't realize this. And they're there too. And you think about this, the ubiquity of information and data, being able to access it from our laptops, being able to access it from our mobile devices, being able to access file shares from anywhere, everywhere, all the time, really makes what we do very hard, very complex. Explosion of devices, explosion of applications, explosion of data, right? It makes it really, really hard to manage. And the result is that we have a broader and ever-expanding attack surface, and the attackers are more and more sophisticated. I mean, we talked about this during some of the keynotes already this week, and I think a lot of people have talked about it in a lot of the different sessions as well. is that it's fairly easy for a hacker to get an SDK to create a vulnerability for a particular application. I mean, it's out there, and they're creating a network for themselves. It's almost like network warfare because they're creating a web of network of attackers almost in a social way so that they can work together to create vulnerabilities, right? So they're armed with more sophistication. We have more complex infrastructure within our environments, making us more and more vulnerable, right? But we got this under control, right? That's why we got compliance. And the data would suggest our average compliance is about 93.7%. But when you peel that data back and you actually look at what that really means, only 20% are fully compliant, 80% are non-compliant, right? And this is within the context of PCI compliance. So we're talking retailers. So Target was PCI compliant. Home Depot was PCI compliant, right? But that didn't stop the data breaches that took place from Target and Home Depot last year. And so when you think about that and you put that in perspective, well, we've put so much focus and emphasis on governance, on regulation, regulatory mandates, and making sure that we meet that legislation and we're regulatory compliant. But the problem is the breaches, the number of incidents. Take a look at this. They've grown by over 48% from 2013 to 2014. Compliance isn't good enough, and that's the point. Is that when we only focus on compliance and governance, we're not really thinking about where are the vulnerabilities, and we think about the complexity of our infrastructure. The vulnerabilities could come from everywhere, and governance and regulation isn't going to solve that problem. It's just going to add more things for us to deal with in terms of administrative headaches, but it doesn't necessarily get us to the root problem, which is how do we solve vulnerabilities in our business, right? But one of the things I will say that audits do have is they give us some clues as to where some of the vulnerabilities and risks are in our businesses. So when you take a look at this data, you'll see that excessive access rights are a key audit finding that come from these audits. We find out that people have higher level access than they really need for their businesses. This one is an interesting one, removal of access following a transfer or termination. This is the common situation where HR has removed somebody from the system because they're no longer with the company, but nobody ever told IT about this, and so the account was never deprovisioned, right? So this is a common problem that we see, and then of course lack of sufficient segregation of duties. So the data is showing, at least from the audit findings, it gives us some clues to see where we can look at risks and vulnerabilities. But if you think about this, and put it in perspective with some of the Verizon data breach, and I think a lot of people here are using some of the same data. It's all coming from the Verizon data breach investigation. And everybody's kind of talked about this to this point at this conference. What's the real challenge? Where's most of the data breaches? What's the root cause for most of the data breaches? Stolen or misused credentials, right? So if the audit findings are telling us people have too much access, or people have privileged access, or people have, or there are inactive accounts that nobody's actually terminated, it's pretty easy to identify where those vulnerabilities are and why stolen and misused credentials are the primary motive for data breaches. So we actually did a survey within our customer base to determine whether our customers would be able to identify a misused or stolen credential within their company. So 29% didn't really know. 29% actually said that they could determine whether a credential was stolen or misused, but 42% said they couldn't. So think about that. And I mean, I'll ask you, I'll kind of do a survey out to everybody in the audience. How confident are you that you would be able to determine whether a credential has been misused or stolen within your business? Raise your hand if you feel very confident that you could identify that. So one. There you go. So clearly, it's not just something we identify within our customer base. This is a fairly common problem. It's very difficult to identify this, right? So it's a real risk to our business. And then, in addition to that, according to a CSO Online, it's now becoming a board-level problem. 66% of board members don't believe that their companies can defend themselves against cyber attacks, and only 4% actually do, right? So this is a real big problem that we don't seem to have the visibility or understanding of how to defend ourselves and how to protect ourselves with misused credentials or stolen credentials. And again, I think this is probably something everybody's seen from the Verizon data breach, but if you think about what I talked about earlier, the sophistication of the hackers and how they're able to get access to information so quickly. 60% of cases, attackers are able to compromise systems within minutes. In less than 40% of the cases, organizations are able to identify these breaches themselves. And then the average time a breach is noticed is 225 days. And just put this in perspective, this was from the Verizon data breach investigations report before last week. And then think about last week when we saw the Office of Personnel Management and the data breach that took place there. If you've read a little bit about that data breach, it appears as though, again, it's all in the allegations and alleged phase. But apparently, supposedly a group of Chinese hackers, at least that's what the speculation is right now, got access to and compromised the Office of Personnel Management system back in about June or July of last year, and it was only discovered in April by the Office of Personnel Management. So that tells you that once they get access, they have access for a long period of time before we ever actually figure it out, right? So this is really, really kind of scary stuff. And the thing about this is, if you think about where the breach life cycle is and kind of where things happen, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on command and control with antivirus, anti-malware, and then other areas like package exfiltration, DLP, SIM, deep packet inspection, et cetera. But if you look at it where the vulnerabilities are, it's right there. It's in the access target. So once they get access, they have access to a stolen misused credential. They can now laterally move between application to application because they have that one credential that gets them in, right? So again, I'll go back to the Office of Personnel Management. If they got access to the system in, say, June, July, and we only found out about it in April, they were able to compromise 4 million records. You don't typically compromise 4 million records in a few minutes. That takes some time, and it takes some time to get access. So they kind of sit there. They wait. They try to understand what's going on, what the patterns are before they attack, right? And so we need to have that visibility and to see where those vulnerabilities are as soon as we possibly can. And so this was a quote from last week's Christian Science Monitor as it relates to specifically the Office of Personnel Management breach from last week. So, companies and large organizations still devote most of their security resources to protecting the perimeter, right? And so once an attacker gets access within the network, there's little or no security on the inside stopping them, right? And I think what I'm saying is you guys have all heard this throughout the conference all this week. We spend so much time protecting the perimeter. According to the Ponemon Institute research that was sponsored by HP, this is actually 85% of IT security resources are spent on protecting the perimeter and protecting the wall, if you will, building the moats. But if we see where the vulnerabilities are, it's once they get inside. So we're spending so much time to protect ourselves from them getting inside. But once they're in, what do we do to stop them? How do we stop them? But, we've got identity and access management systems that we thought can help. So let me ask you, we got provisioning systems. And when you get an access request for a specific person or a system, how many of you actually know or have deep understanding into that approval process? Or are you just kind of, okay, seems like this person needs access. I don't really know any better. I'll give him access. So how many of you actually really understand the access, the risks associated with it, before you actually go through an approval process? Okay, good. I presume the rest of you don't really have deep understanding of the access requests. And it's not to say that anybody should feel like it's wrong or if they don't know, because in most companies, they don't. The approval process is kind of a rubber stamp. Somebody comes in, says, I need access to this particular system for this particular entitlement. Nobody really knows the business justification behind it. We've just built an automated approval process, so okay, fine, I'll approve it. But I don't really know whether I need to approve it or not. Similarly, for governance purposes, think about the access review certification process. How many of you really have deep understanding as to whether or not the right person has the right access when you do those access review certifications? I would anticipate that the answer is somewhat similar to the approval process in that it's also probably a rubber stamp. All right, looks good. seems like the right person has right access, we're happy, which of course drives the high compliance rates as well. So, the real question is, do we actually do the research that's necessary to really determine whether the right people have that right access? Probably not. But, and we think about where the risk areas are. So we've done some research here from our customer base, and these are kind of the risk areas that our customers have told us that really give them a lot of anxiety. Areas around privileged accounts, unnecessary entitlements, abandoned accounts, and orphaned accounts as well. So let me ask you, if you guys had visibility into this type of data, do you think it would help you at least give you some visibility, something you can do to do immediate remediation if possible? Would that be of interest, right? So it was something that came from our customers. These are the things that they're most anxious about. But the problem is, we get back to this concept of the explosion of devices, the explosion of applications. And you think about it, it's a big data problem. We have millions of identities. We have hundreds of policies and regulations. We have thousands of applications and resources, lots of different access rights, millions of actions, and trillions of access relationships to traverse. So this is really a big data problem. It's very difficult to traverse all of these relationships. So where the market is headed, we believe, is around being able to take this information, make sense of this so that people have visibility into how these vulnerabilities affect their businesses and affect their organizations. So thinking about things with the ability to understand risk and being able to quantify risk and vulnerabilities and to be able to take action on those risks and vulnerabilities at the moment in time that you identify that, and being able to push these risk notifications so that we take immediate action, and being more proactive in the provisioning process and the governance process. You know, having visibility using dashboards into the abandoned accounts and understanding where these might be, what are the particular accounts that might be risks for abandonment that we should be taking action on as quickly and as immediately as possible. Having the ability to navigate and explore specific access for a particular user. So I'll give you an example with this character named Greg Smith. What if he's a sales manager, but in an Active Directory group that's nested, he somehow got an entitlement for a director level position, which, you know, some people, sometimes people set up Active Directory and there are some mistakes in terms of the groupings, especially at the nested grouping level. Sometimes that happens. I don't know if that has ever happened to any of your companies, but we've seen it happen quite a bit where there has been some kind of mess up in the nesting of the groups, right? So all of a sudden we find out that there's a group problem here by looking at the exploration of what this particular person has access to and having that visibility to navigate through kind of a web or a tree structure to see what the access levels are, what the groupings are, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, thinking about having visibility into your accounts through the audit process and understanding where risks are before the audits happen. So in this particular instance, this is a particular audit result across a number of different applications, which is great. You only found a few audit findings here and there, and everybody's happy, right? It's a great audit result. But when you actually look deeper and really understand what that audit result means and understand where those findings are, you might actually find, and this was actually a real situation that we found with one of our customers, that some of those check marks may have been an inactive account. It was the right person, but it was actually inactive, and there was some lack of oversight. The password wasn't reset, so that's a little bit of a risk to the business. Some of these where there were X marks, where it was an audit finding that came up through the audit. Well, it turns out this happened to be a person that was no longer with the company that had access to a privileged account. So once they had access to a privileged account that happened to be inactive, somebody got that. Somebody misused or stole that credential. Now you've got super user, admin level rights to a number of different applications. And now you got the lateral movement going on, which is real vulnerability to your business. And so this person wasn't in the HR system, but they had the right access level. They were in there for some time. It was a rubber stamp approval, and it could have caused tremendous business risk. It caused tremendous risk to the business, excuse me. And so by being able to see this, visualize this, and understand this, they were able to take remediation action on this, even though it was an audit finding, but they were able to take remediation because they add the visibility to understand where the risk was and what the problem was and took action upon it. So again, when we think about governance, think of it, what are the risk areas? So for example, what if there was a new account created outside of the provisioning system, or it was a high-risk application, high-risk sense of entitlements, or employee that was not in the HR system, and another and another. And what you want to do here is, again, it's not about the audit process. Yes, the audit process is important in making sure that you have certification reviews every 6 to 12 months. But what if you understood the risk and you identified those risks and took immediate action and triggered what we call a micro-certification? A micro-certification meaning that you actually do the certification immediately right then and there rather than every 6 to 12 months so that you have access to that. So what if you could take provisioning to the next level and understanding risk in the provisioning process? So today, this is typically the workflow for a provisioning process. But what if you could understand risk as part of that provisioning process and actually determine if it's a low-risk entitlement or a low-risk access request? You could automatically fulfill it without going through an approval process. Or there was a medium-level risk, and you wanted to go through an approval process or rejection process because there was some risk associated with that access request. Or it was a pretty high-risk entitlement that's being requested, and you go through another provisioning process, which actually goes through the approval process. So really, it's about using risk to gain efficiencies in the provisioning process, using risk to take immediate remediation action during the governance process, rather than waiting 6 to 12 months during your access review certification process, right? And so when we think of identity and access management, we think of it as an evolution, kind of where it originally started in password transaction management, provisioning, et cetera, to more of a governance-led, regulatory compliance-led identity access management generation around enabling efficiencies with certification reviews and processes, to where we're going, the next generation of identity and access management being driven by intelligence, enabling better decision-making in real time, and seeing and acting on things impossible to do before, right? And, intelligent identity access management, when Gartner comes out with a quote that said, but that seems to not be showing. There might be a Mac to PC issue, sorry. But by the year end 2020, identity analytics and intelligence tools will deliver direct business value in 60% of enterprises, up from less than 5% today. So we think that providing visibility and analytics to help drive the provisioning and the governance process is really going to enable efficiency and help companies understand risk to their businesses. And we do it through using policy-driven intelligent identity and access management to do continuous and actionable monitoring and analytics to drive the provisioning and governance process to ultimately help mitigate risk to the business. Like I said before, it's hard. What we do is hard. It's difficult. But we need to understand risk in the context of our business and be able to take action immediately based on those risk factors. So with that, thanks. I'll open up for questions.
We've got about a minute or two. Any questions for Venkat?
Yes.
Grab them later in the hallway too. I'll start from in the back.
So I think it kind of depends. We've actually built out of the box, for us at least, we identified about 21 different risk factors, but I think it continues to grow, right? It's not really a static number. It continues to evolve. It continues to grow. And for every company, there are different risk factors in simply in the way that they do business. We've identified, at least from our customers, they gave us 4 in particular around privileged accounts, orphaned accounts, through some surveys that we did. But it continues to grow, and we see that every day, especially as the vulnerabilities continue to happen and the breaches continue to happen. The hackers are getting more and more sophisticated. So it's really kind of incumbent upon us as a community to work together to identify what some of those additional risk factors are beyond kind of our research that we've done within our business.